Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the Fujifilm GF 45mm F2.8 RWR lens. The R stands for ring. In this case, it refers to Fuji's dual approach to aperture. You can control it either automatically from within the camera or via the manual aperture ring. WR refers to the fact that the lens is weather sealed, starting from a gasket at the lens mount and proceeding to a total of 10 different seal points throughout the lens. So this is a professional lens that is designed for real-world use. Now, the GF 45mm is designed specifically for Fujifilm's GFX medium format system, and that sensor has a crop factor of 0.79, meaning that this lens has a full frame equivalency of 35.5 millimeters, so roughly corresponding to the traditional 35mm focal length, which is one of my favorite focal lengths. It's incredibly versatile for a wide variety of subjects. And so this is a lens that I consider to be kind of one of the building blocks of a basic kit for the GFX system. And as such, I kind of find this lens to be somewhat of a comparative of the F2 primes from Fuji for their APS-C system. And that those F2 X-mount lenses, 23mm, 35mm, 50mm, etc., those type lenses I really do think are kind of a sweet spot for the system in that you're paying a moderate price, you're getting good performance, and you're getting, relatively small size. Now, all of that scales up when you move to the larger sensor size of the GFX system, but in many ways, it's the same kind of concept. And so you're getting a lens that I don't think is spectacular. You're not going to fall in love with the magical rendering from this lens, but it is extremely competent on many levels. It gets the job done. And while I've heard some people assert, even some of you in the audience, that the glass on the GFX system is nowhere near as good as what the sensor performance is of the cameras, I see no real basis for that with this particular lens. As we're going to see, it doesn't really have any problem resolving the sensor of the camera and delivering very strong performance. And so there's no issue with the performance. It's just that overall, I consider this to be more of a workman lens rather than some kind of dreamy, magical, lens that you're just going to love the images out of it because of some kind of special rendering quality. No, this is a lens more that you're going to be able to rely on to get the job done. Now, nothing is cheap in the GFX system, although relatively it's cheaper than, of course, almost all medium format alternatives. In this case, you've got a lens that prices in at $1,699 US, $1,700 and so that is, expensive from a, absolute point of view. From a medium format point of view, that is a fairly inexpensive lens. And so that is part of the appeal. It's also moderately sized. All of the GF mount lenses are going to be fairly wide in diameter because the mount size is so wide to begin with. And so you're picking up a lot of kind of girth there. And so this is an 84mm lens, but as we're going to see from looking up front at it, it's only got a 62mm front filter thread. So it actually tapers down to the front of the lens, which tells you that really the biggest factor in the lens being as wide as what it is actually the mount itself, not what's required for the entrance pupil, as it's often called, the front element where the light enters into the lens optical formula. It's 88mm in length, which means it's almost as wide as it is long. It's a squat kind of lens, but in no way is it extreme, and the weight is quite moderate, only 490 grams. And so they've done a good job with that in that they have created a lens that you can tell has a very nice degree of build, but they've kept it down to a moderate weight. And so obviously that's going to be helpful. For example, when you start off with the GFX 100 body that I tested on, you're already starting with well over 1,400 grams. And so, you're able to moderate that a bit by having a lens like this that isn't excessively heavy. I will point out that the only other ways to get to this very important focal length are in a couple of the zoom lenses. And there's two zoom lenses that cover this. I think it's 32 to 64 millimeter f4 and then 45 to 100 millimeter f4 lenses. I'll note in both of those cases, though, you're talking about a lens that weighs twice as much, has a half as big of maximum aperture of only f4, and are about $600 more expensive. So if 35 millimeters is what you actually want, this is the probably best way to get there currently on the system. The manual focus ring is fairly nicely damped on the lighter side, but it has fairly good precision. It's wide, it's ribbed, falls easily to hand. Nothing bad there. Nothing else really on the lens itself. No switches or anything. You're going to control AF/MF from within the camera body. And so, outside of that, fairly featureless. One thing I will point out is that, at least on the copy that I am reviewing here, the lens hood, it bayonets into place. There's no lock, and in this case, it's not all that difficult to break it free of that, and so you may just want to keep an eye on that, it wouldn't be all that hard to jar it loose, and you certainly wouldn't want to lose it. Not that I had any problem with that per se when I was out hiking with the lens, for example. So let's talk about the autofocus here for a second. This lens has probably something like a DC motor in it. It doesn't have the more premium linear motors, or it would cite that as a part of the designation. So as a byproduct of that, you've got DC motors are not as sophisticated as the linear motors, and so they tend to be much louder in operation, maybe not quite as fast. Though in this case, focus speed, I would say, is actually fairly good for the most part. There is a fair amount of different noises involved in the process of focus, and as we'll see in a moment from doing kind of video focus pulls, you can definitely hear that variety of noises, shuffling, whirring, little clicks, different noises that are there. It's certainly not silent, though I think that for taking stills, you probably will not hear it after a while. It's just not fantastic for video work. I did find some situations where it refused to focus on a foreground subject, and so I had to use manual focus to draw it back, like in this image. And you can see, obviously, when it's properly focused, the image is much more intriguing. But outside of that, in many situations, if I was just out general purpose shooting in the woods, as I like to do, I could forget that I was shooting medium format at times. It's more when pushed to the limits. I didn't find it, as amazing for obviously for video work. And then obviously if you try to shoot any kind of action, this is not an action camera system in any way, shape, or form. And so it's basically very good for general purpose and gets the job done for that. Let's take a look at those video pulls as mentioned and see the various things that happen as a part of that. And so as you can see, that is not really a great result. There's a lot of noises there. There's also a lot of unnecessary focus racking, settling. There's just not great confidence either between the lens or the current degree of focus systems and the GFX system. We're just not quite there in terms of the standard that we've come to expect, even on the XF platform APS-C, so say an XT3 or an XT4, we're not as sophisticated even as that, I would say, in our focus precision, and focus sound obviously is a little noisier than what we would like. IAF worked fine, and whenever I had people in the frame, whether it was a group or individuals, I got good focus results, consistent focus, and so I have no real objections or concerns there. Focus got the job done, and I will note that this lens was the better lens of the two I had at the same time. I had the new GF 80mm f1.7. I definitely preferred focus action on this lens, though, again, that's relative to the system itself. If you compare it to what I'm accustomed to on other systems these days, it's still a little bit primitive by behavior. What is not primitive, however, is a very strong optical performance, and we're going to dive in and look at that in some detail now. Let's take a look. So let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. We can see that distortion is pretty much non-existent here. Very, very little evidence of distortion, not really hardly even worth correcting. There is a bit of vignette, nothing extreme here, but enough that is worthy of correction. And I used a +30 in the in Lightroom here, just in the vignette slider, I added a +30 and then moved the midpoint over to give a nice linear result, but no major problems there at all. We can also see that while there is a hint of both purple and green fringing, if we're looking at longitudinal chromatic aberration, it is so minimal as to where it's not really going to be any kind of factor in any kind of real world images. And so no problem there on that front. If we take a look at along the corners of the frame and the areas that should be black and white without any kind of color fringing, we can see that they are. And so there isn't really any evidence of lateral chromatic aberration here as well. So aberrations, chromatic aberrations of both types are nicely controlled in the GF 45mm. We can see this in the field as well. You know, this image, for example, there's lots of opportunity for aberrations, you know, very bright subject here, the snow going towards defocus. But you can see that there is beautiful acuity here and also that there is no evidence of fringing in this high contrast situation right here. So that gives us a lot of encouragement for, you know, real-world contrast and resolution, and we can see even at a 200% level on 102 megapixel GFX 100 sensor here that we do in fact have fantastic resolution here. Contrast is good, not as exceptional as what I've seen on some other lenses, but good, and you can see that stopping down to f4 does start to improve that contrast and allow that amazing resolution to pop even more. If we look at the mid frame, we can see that the results are good, but again, contrast not exceptional at f2.8. At f4 it is, however, and you can see massive amounts of resolution here in the bill. Even this text here, which is tiny by the way, is extremely clear. If we pop down into the corner, we see a nice even performance in that there is good detail right into the very, very edge of the frame. But what we're finding is as we stop it down, number one, I think there's a little bit of a natural kind of overall contrast and brightness lift, but then the micro contrast allows the darks and the brights to have more contrast between them, and thus the details pop a little bit more. Stopping on down to f5.6, as we can see, kind of completes that process and really continues to improve contrast to nice exceptional levels here. Now we can see that there is no further gains really to be had at f8, and starting after f8 you'll start to see the effects of diffraction. Minimum aperture is actually f32, but you can see that even compared to f2.8, diffraction has long robbed us of any kind of acuity, and now all of those beautiful details are just kind of mushy due to diffraction. So I don't recommend shooting at minimum apertures unless absolutely necessary. So as we can see, our minimum focus, distance, and thus maximum magnification of 0.14 times is, you know, not particularly exceptional. We can see, however, that at a pixel level it is delivering very, very good detail and, you know, nice contrast. And so the nice thing here with a high resolution body like this is that you can always crop in and make it pretend to be much more of a macro lens than what it actually is, because you have such amazing resolution and a strong performance up close. So, you know, if you want to get up close to something, you can crop in and create the image that you want, even though the minimum focus distance is not necessarily amazing. Now we can see in real world images that incredible cropping ability there as well. So if we zoom in at a pixel level, you can see that all throughout the frame, this is I think f5.6. You can see that there's just fantastic detail everywhere. So you have tremendous latitude for cropping into landscape images and really kind of getting the image you want. And so it's kind of incredible that a 35mm equivalent lens can basically double as a telephoto in, you know, at least as far as, you know, getting you close to action. It's not going to behave like a telephoto, but you certainly can get much closer to your subject due to being able to deeply crop due to that high resolution. Another case in point to this image here, so it would still be quite easy. Remember, I'm testing on a 4K monitor, and so here we see at a pixel level on a 4K monitor, I'm able to, you know, create a still 4K image, you know, this deeply that is, you know, radically different from the original, which by the way is cropped to 16:9 from the original 4:3. So there's even more resolution than that on tap to begin with. So one more image here that shows off that really this lens it's doing just fine in managing this major sensor here. And you can see zooming into a pixel level that, in all of these trees, there's just lovely detail. And as you can see, right off toward the corners of the frame, we're still getting good resolution and contrast here at landscape apertures. So just for the fun of it, I did a little bit of an experiment where I compared the GFX 100 and the GF 45mm to the Canon R5 with the, I would say probably superior lens, the EF 35mm f1.4L Mark II, which is, in my opinion, one of Canon's very best prime lenses that are telephoto. And so I then changed the crop here down to match it to the R5, but then also downsampled the Fuji's image to the same pixel level, which should give a little bit of advantage to that sensor because you're packing in more. So a few general observations. You can definitely see that the Fuji's image is slightly cooler and the Canon's image is slightly warmer by comparison. And you can also see that there's just a little bit more nuance maybe in the Fuji image, which we'll explore more in just a second. First of all, however, if we're just talking about detail, and I'll match these up here, you can see that as far as detail goes, they're really more similar than different. You've got a really excellent lens there on the Canon, and so obviously, glass does help. But at the same time, I will point out that the Fuji lens is, holding its own in terms of, producing nice detail and contrast. And so I wouldn't say there's a radical difference in the performance of the two when it comes to that. What I did notice, however, is that if I looked at an area like this, for example, there's just a lot more variation in the various levels of tonality. You can just see a little bit better levels of dynamic range and contrast that are there. And so, overall, I still do favor the image out of the Fuji combination. By the way, I own this, so if you're going to accuse me of prejudice, I should be prejudiced in this direction. But I do think that this is delivering just a slightly richer image with a little more information that is there overall. So obviously in lens with this kind of focal length and maximum aperture is not going to be a background obliterator, but we can see as we look in at the bokeh circles that there's a little bit of activity in them, but overall they're fairly clean and obviously no evidence of fringing. We saw that that was well controlled. So we have the makings for a decent bokeh performance. In this image here, we can see maybe just a little bit of busyness, again, due to it not having a huge maximum aperture or long focal length, but the quality of the bokeh is pretty decent, and of course the detail, the fine detail and contrast on the image itself, on the subject, is really fabulous. In this particular image, I saw a little bit more outlining than what I would like for those same reasons already mentioned, and at the same time, also the good stuff that we have pointed out previously as well. This one I like a little bit better. I think that maybe just the nature of the area of defocus kind of suits the lens's rendering a little bit more. And as before, I see just wonderful, fine detail there and contrast on the subject. And so I would say that the lens is slightly weighted towards detail. As we can see, aberrations are well corrected, but at the same time, the bokeh quality is still certainly acceptable, if not any kind of magical rendering there. Finally, let's talk about flare resistance. I found flare resistance to be fairly strong here. There are their nano GI coatings on here, and so you can see that there isn't any kind of destructive ghosting artifacts here on the F4 image. Contrast is held up fairly well. And if we kind of zoom in, we can see that there's a little bit of a localized veiling, but the actual contrast and detail is still great there. If we look at F11, stop down a little bit further, we can see that overall, again, contrast is holding up pretty good. We can see that there's a little bit more kind of busyness in terms of these prismatic blobs that are coming off. But again, to me it seems fairly non-destructive, and so overall I think that this is a lens that you can point at the sun and not have too much stress in doing so. And so as you can see, no real optical flaws there. Nothing that I can point to. Distortion is low, vignette is only moderate, flare resistance is fairly good. You know, a lot of good things across the frame. The only thing that I will say is that the quality of the bokeh is only so-so. And so it's certainly not a, you know, I did a brief comparison to the Canon 35mm f1.4L Mark II. That lens has much more attractive rendering by comparison. And so that's an area where this is only okay in terms of performance. I definitely preferred the rendering from the 80mm f1.7, you know, which is probably to be expected due to the nature of the two lenses. So as I said in our introduction, I think that this is a lens that really is a workman kind of lens. I think it's reliable. You're going to get very good images with it. You're going to be able to rely on it to be stable and to perform in the way that you want. And images are going to be great in terms of detail and handling aberrations, but the overall rendering of the glass is just okay. It's not exceptional in any particular way. But at this point, this is as good as it gets on the system, and I'm really thankful for lenses like this that provide you, again, good workman quality lenses to get the job done and to pair with that exceptional sensor and sensors that Fuji has available on their GFX cameras. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. Also linkage there to an image gallery if you want to check that out. There's also linkage there below to check out my merchandise. There are new things that are being added there, so be sure to take a look at that. Beyond that, there's also linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.